Welcome to the fourth and final episode in a Legendarium series about the history of pilgrimage. In Part 4, The Reformist Fire, we will talk about how Protestant reformers challenged pilgrimage at a time when it became commercialized like never before. The most ambitious pilgrims of the late medieval world could travel to Venice, where a travel office provided guides who took devotees from Italy to Jaffa. On the sea journey, pilgrims crowded together in a small space, eating bad food and foul-smelling water. Arguments became commonplace, especially if someone started getting seasick. Upon arriving in Southwest Asia, the sight of vast slave markets horrified pilgrims, yet officialdom tolerated the pilgrims if they paid a tax required by all non-Muslims in Southwest Asia. Some ship captains got around this tax by claiming the pilgrims as crew. After getting past officialdom, the pilgrims climbed 2,000 feet above sea level and remained in Jerusalem for 6 weeks, staying at a monastery or hospital run by their countrymen. There they could visit a cave said to contain the beds of Adam and Eve and a pillar of salt that had once been Lot's wife. Of course, the most important site for any pilgrim lay in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ walked, lived, and died. Many even slept there to be reborn as Christ was restored to life. During the 14th century, judicial pilgrimage became a common punishment in France and Italy. Between 1350 and 1360, the port city of Ghent in northwest Belgium sentenced 1,367 convicts to go on pilgrimage to 133 different holy sites. If the criminal committed murder, the authorities hung the murder weapon around the convict's neck for the duration of the pilgrimage. Those convicted of heresy wore 2 yellow crosses on their front and back. The criminals had to collect signatures at all the shrines they visited as proof that they arrived. Sometimes the convict undertook the pilgrimage barefoot or with no clothes on. One infamous case required a man who burned down a church to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times while wearing chains. With wealthy monasteries competing to procure holy relics and thus attract more pilgrims, an underground trade in false relics sought to help the monks keep their vows of poverty better. It also created a new class of criminals who might well be undertaking some of those penitential journeys. Geoffrey Chaucer parodied such men in the Canterbury Tales, introducing a partner who sells pig bones as saint relics. Martin Luther himself commented that enough pieces of the true cross had been sold to rebuild Noah's Ark. Pilgrimage and relics had become commercialized, and people knew it. By the 15th century, the idea of a vicarious pilgrimage became acceptable among the ruling class, a sign of how some sought to use the commercialization of pilgrimage for their own benefit, not only financially but spiritually. Always fearful for her health, a noblewoman named Isabel of Bavaria sent numerous pilgrims, including members of her family, to sacred places across France. One pilgrim traveled to Notre-Dame du Blanc-Mesnil with a 15-pound candle and instructions from Isabel to pray there for 15 days, burning a pound of candle wax each day. This practice branched out into pilgrimage guides, which provided a travelogue of the great shrines of Italy and France and could supposedly carry the spiritual weight of making the pilgrimage itself. It even provided prayers that the aspiring pilgrim would have said at these holy places if they could be bothered to leave home. With pilgrimage becoming so commercialized and robbed of its spiritual value, did anyone come to question it as they did in Roman times? Yes, they did. Of them, the most important would be Martin Luther. In 1520, Martin Luther wrote All pilgrimages should be stopped. There is no good in them. No commandment enjoins them. No obedience attaches to them. Rather do these pilgrimages give countless occasions to commit sin and to despise God's commandments. Luther suggested that emphasis on special holy places devalued other locations, such as the local parish church, where he hoped a spiritual revolution would unfold. Luther also argued that believers should expect to encounter God, who is the same God everywhere. He also argued that many pilgrims simply hope to avoid their daily responsibilities by lighting off to the nearest shrine. Wherever they took power, Protestants declared war on pilgrimage. Officials gathered stories about real and suspected corruption, using them to justify the destruction of holy places. To show that shrines had no power, radicals seized them, scattered relics in the dirt, and smashed them to bits. In England, a popular uprising against such destruction erupted in 1536. King Henry VIII crushed the so-called Pilgrimage of Grace by executing 200 rebel leaders by hanging them with chains from York city walls until they strangled. Protestant monarchs like Henry fobbed off compliant monks, nuns, and friars with pensions. Those who defied the destruction went to the chopping block and became martyrs. The authorities then seized the houses which kept these relics and sold them to the highest bidder. Regardless of one's feelings about pilgrimage, this represented a terrible cultural loss for many reliquaries and libraries filled with illuminated manuscripts vanished in the Reformist fire. Yet in countries that remained faithful to the Catholic Church, pilgrimage continues even to this day. And curiously, the word pilgrimage seems to have retained power in Protestant countries. Protestant writers such as John Bunyan and Walter Raleigh spoke of faith as a pilgrimage, the one of the soul and mind, not one in the physical world. During the 18th century, men spoke of the Grand Tour as a cultural pilgrimage for aristocratic young men through the ruins of Greece and Rome. And most tellingly, the fervent Protestants who left England to found Massachusetts colony called themselves the Pilgrims. And so the Pilgrim's spirit continues to survive into our modern age. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.